Have you ever reached a moment when everything you treasured seemed worthless compared to the hunger in your belly or the emptiness in your soul? Imagine standing in a dusty frontier store, clutching the last reminder of your old life, a gold wedding ring, only to realize it could not fill an empty plate. That's where Lila Porter found herself, a widow with nothing left but courage. What would you do if survival meant trading the very symbol of love you once built a future upon? Could you let go of the past to find a new beginning? Or would you cling to it even as the world around you crumbled? This isn't just a story about hardship. It's about choices the kind that define not only survival, but the possibility of love, dignity, and belonging. And it makes us wonder, if we were in her shoes, would we have the strength to risk everything for a second chance? Stay with us, because this tale will carry you into the heart of the American frontier, where grit was life, love was salvation, and gold was never enough. Before we begin, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss the stories that keep history's heartbeat alive. Dust lifted in little spirals around Lila Porter's worn boots as she lingered in front of Whitford's general store. In her trembling hand rested a small gold band, the last token of a life that had slipped away. The Kansas sun pressed down heavy on the boardwalk, and she could feel the quiet stares of strangers prickling her back. At only 24, she was already a widow, left with nothing but a faded dress, a travel-stained carpet bag, and that ring that once promised a forever. "Please, Mr. Whitford," she murmured, pushing the band across the counter. Amos Whitford, a heavy-set man with gray whiskers, barely glanced at it. He shook his head. "Ma'am, I've said it before. Gold won't fill an empty stomach. What folks need out here is hands for the harvest, not trinkets." He nudged the ring back with a blunt finger. Her stomach twisted painfully. She hadn't eaten more than scraps in 3 days. Not since she spent her last coin on a stale biscuit in the last town. Pride had kept her from begging, but pride was turning costly. "Just a little bread," she whispered, "or some cornmeal. Anything at all." The bell above the door jingled as another customer stepped in. She kept her eyes on the counter, willing the storekeeper to take pity. The ring had once been bought in St. Louis, her husband Henry Talbot saving for months to surprise her. Now it felt no more valuable than a pebble off the prairie. "Trouble here?" Whitford, a deep voice asked from behind. "No trouble. Mr. Rowan. Just telling this young lady we don't deal in gold." Lila turned. The newcomer stood tall and lean, his face bronzed from years under the open sky. His canvas trousers, blue work shirt, and leather vest were neat but practical. Not a townsman, not a drifter either. "Ma'am," he said with a small tip of his hat. His prairie green eyes swept over her worn dress and hollow cheeks. "I was leaving," she muttered, reaching for the ring. Her fingers shook. "That's a wedding band," he observed quietly. She could only nod. "Whitford, give this lady some provisions. Put it on my account." The storekeeper frowned. "Now, Mr. Rowan." "My account," the man repeated firmly. Then, turning back to her, "Ma'am, forgive me for speaking plain, but gold isn't what folks need out here. You are." She blinked. Sure she had misheard. "My father runs Rowan Ranch, 5 miles north. We lost our cook last month when she married and went west. We've got 8 men who can rope a steer blindfolded, but none can boil beans without burning them." A faint smile tugged at his mouth. "If you can cook, and you're not afraid of work, there's a place for you. Room, board, wages." Her throat tightened. Once she'd been a merchant's wife in Missouri. Then fever took Henry, and the bank took the rest. Cooking for ranch hands wasn't the life she'd imagined, but starving on the prairie wasn't much of a life either. "I can cook," she whispered. "Then we'd be obliged if you'd consider." Whitford set her up with supplies, some decent ones. As the storekeeper reluctantly filled a basket with cornmeal, salt pork, beans, and even a bit of sugar, the stranger studied her. "When was your last proper meal?" he asked. "That's not your concern. Mr. Caleb Rowan," he supplied, matter of fact. "It is my concern, if you're going to work for us. Can't have you fainting into a stew pot." His tone was firm, not unkind. "There's a boarding house across the street. Mrs. Maeve Kincaid serves a fair noon plate. Rest there, eat well. I'll come back with the wagon in 2 hours. I haven't accepted yet. No, ma'am, but you're thinking on it, or you'd have walked away." He set coins on the counter. "For Mrs. Kincaid. Make sure she gets there safe," he told Whitford. "At the door." He paused. "Keep your ring. Mrs. Porter. Lila Porter. Mrs. Porter. Out here. We don't trade away our memories. We just learn how to carry them different." With that, he was gone. Whitford handed her the basket, heavier than she expected. "Caleb Rowan's a good man," he said grudgingly. "His father's fair, too. It's honest work." Through the window, she saw Rowan mount his horse with easy grace, glance back once, then tip his hat before riding off in a swirl of dust. The Kincaid boarding house sagged but stood tall across the street. Inside, Mrs. Kincaid, a small woman with sharp eyes and sharper words, looked Lila up and down before seating her by the kitchen. "Caleb Rowan sent you? Did he? That's a decent boy. Shame about his mother passing last year. That ranch hasn't been the same without a woman's hand on it." She slid a plate of beef stew and cornbread in front of Lila. "Eat, child. You look like a breeze could blow you clear into Nebraska." The food was plain but plentiful. Lila forced herself to eat slow, turning the ring in her hand as she remembered Henry's proud smile the day he slipped it on her finger. "Nothing wrong with starting over," Mrs. Kincaid remarked, watching her. "These plains are full of folks trying again, some running from, some running to. The lucky ones find what they're meant for." 2 hours later, with a worn carpetbag at her feet and the basket of supplies by her side, Lila stood on the porch as the creak of wagon wheels drew near. Caleb Rowan was coming back around the bend. Caleb Rowan handled the team with the same steady ease he had shown inside Whitford's general store. He set the brake, climbed down, and tipped his hat to Lila Porter where she waited on the porch of the Kincaid boarding house. He asked if she had decided to take a chance on the ranch. She told him it seemed she had little choice. He answered that there is always a choice out here, only that some roads promise more honest days than others. He lifted her humble carpetbag into the wagon bed as if it weighed nothing at all. He said the ranch lay a fair piece to the north, and they would make it by sundown if the road held. Lila settled on the wooden seat, the basket of provisions at her feet, and took one last look at the Kansas town behind her. She marked the wide front windows of Whitford's store, where she had nearly traded away the last bright piece of her old life. She noted the boarding house kitchen, where kindness had worn a plain apron and tasted of beef stew and warm cornbread. She looked along the dusty street that had pushed her toward a choice she never thought she would consider. Caleb gathered the reins, and the wagon rolled forward with a creak and a groan, wheels finding the ruts that so many wagons had made before them. The prairie opened like a sea around them, tall grass moving in waves under a slow wind. A hawk turned lazy circles overhead, far off. A line of cottonwoods drew a pale green seam across the horizon where water must be. The sky was so wide that a person felt small beneath it, and for a moment that smallness was both a comfort and a trouble. They rode a while without words, listening to the rhythmic clop of the team and the gentle rattle of harness rings. Lila kept one hand on the ring in her pocket. She did not plan to sell it now, but she needed to feel its smooth edge against her skin, as if the old promise could steady the new road. Caleb asked softly if her husband had passed. She said fever had carried Henry Talbot away 6 months before. He told her he was sorry for her loss, then kept silent in the respectful way of men who know that sorry is a small word that still must be said. When the town's last roofline dropped behind a swell of grass, she asked if his father would mind him hiring a stranger. Caleb said his father, Silas Rowan, trusted his judgment, and that this country is nothing but strangers until work and weather turn them into neighbors. He glanced toward the ring hand resting in her lap and then looked back to the road. He said his mother had always claimed that the prairie takes the softness out of a person, but if a body is strong enough to keep going, the land gives back a different sort of soft, the kind that comes from living through storms and still finding beauty. Lila held that thought in the quiet that followed. She had lost the gentle things of her first life, the tidy rooms and the easy talk of a merchant's household, yet she was still breathing, still moving, and perhaps that counted for more than she had let herself believe. Afternoon wore on. They crossed a shallow draw where water trickled over smooth stones, and the horses drank gratefully. A meadowlark sang from a fence wire, half buried in grass. Caleb pointed out a faint wagon track where freighters once hauled goods toward the railhead. He spoke of spring blizzards, summer lightning, and autumn days when the wind smelled like apples, though no orchard was near. He did not talk to fill the air. He talked to pass the land to her in little pieces, as if he were setting stones across a creek and inviting her to step. The sun slipped lower, and the light turned warm and amber. Caleb lifted his chin toward the north and told her to look there. Lila narrowed her eyes. At first she saw only more prairie. Then the distance gave up its secrets. A pitched roof, long and low. A sturdy barn with a cupola. A bunkhouse stretched like a loaf pan. Beyond them, the slow motion of cattle shifting in a corral and a spoonful of smoke rising from a kitchen chimney. By the measure of Missouri towns, it was not much. Against the emptiness, it looked like a promise kept. Caleb said, "Welcome to Rowan Ranch." Such as it is. Lila sat a little straighter. The woman who had been soft and carefully kept in a merchant's home felt far away. The woman who stepped down from this wagon was still being shaped by wind and want and work. She touched the ring once more, then slid it deeper into her pocket. She was not throwing it away. She was learning how to carry it different. They stopped in front of the main house just as the sun touched the land and laid a rosy wash over the siding. Before Caleb could come around to help her down, the front door opened and an older man stepped out. He had the same tall lines as his son, and a steadiness in his eyes that spoke of many seasons. Caleb introduced Lila as the new cook who had agreed to join them. The older man tipped his hat and said her name in a plain greeting. He looked like weather had carved his face, but had not turned his mouth hard. He said he had heard she had fallen on hard days. Lila met his gaze and answered that she was willing to work, and that was the only thing that mattered to her now. Something eased at the corner of the older man's mouth. He said fair enough, then told her supper rang at 6. Sharp and hungry men could be ornery when kept waiting. He added that they were glad to have her, and that it had been too long since that kitchen saw right use. Inside. The kitchen sat large and serviceable, with a cast-iron stove big as a small mule, stout tables scarred by knives, and shelves lined with jars and sacks. Dust lay on every surface. A stack of blackened pots told the story of well-meaning hands and burned beans. The sink brimmed with dishes that had been soaking too long. Caleb set her bag down and apologized for the sight. Lila rolled up her sleeves without ceremony. She told him she would need water brought in and heated, and she would need to learn where they kept everything. Caleb said he would fetch water and set kettles on. He told her her room was through the side door, small but private, once a pantry until his mother had it turned into a bed space. The little room proved exactly that. A narrow bed with a quilt, a washstand with a cracked pitcher, one window that looked down the slope toward the barn, where she could see men moving like shadows in the last light. Lila laid her spare dress across the footboard and set her comb on the washstand. She breathed once, long and slow, then returned to the kitchen where the work waited. She asked how many mouths she would be feeding. Caleb answered that 8 hands came to the table, plus his father and himself, and that number grew during spring branding or autumn roundups. He said the men put in long days and ate like they meant it. As he pumped water into buckets and set them to heat, Lila took stock. The larder held flour, cornmeal, dry beans, salt, coffee, and a side of pork hanging cool in the cellar. Onions and potatoes sat in bins. On a high shelf she found jars of peaches that must have been put up the summer before Margaret Rowan passed. She traced the rims of those jars with her fingertip and imagined the woman who had sealed them against the cold months, then put them back carefully. Some things deserved a proper Sunday to open. Caleb worked at the stove damper until the fire caught with a friendly roar. He showed her where kindling was stacked and where the coffee mill lived. He apologized again for the state of things. She told him she was used to messes that needed setting right and asked what time the ranch rose. He said first light saw the bunkhouse moving, and he added that coffee at 5 made men feel the day belonged to them instead of the other way around. 1. While the kettle sang, Lila scrubbed the worst of the black from the big iron pot and set aside 2 more that were past saving. She moved steady and sure, the way her mother had taught her in Ohio, and the way Henry had praised when money was tight and meals had to stretch. She found a willow broom by the door and swept dust toward a pan until the floorboards looked like they remembered being wood again. Caleb returned with more water and asked quietly if the room would do. She said it would do fine. Silas Rowan appeared in the doorway then, leaning his shoulder against the frame, like a man taking the measure of a situation. He watched her scrape a stubborn pot and nodded once to himself. He asked if she would be all right with the morning hour. Lila said a kitchen belongs to the dawn, and she had no quarrel with early bells. Silas answered that his wife had said the same thing, and then he shifted his gaze to the stove and smiled in a small way that did not show teeth. He said it smelled like a kitchen again. Twilight deepened outside. The bunkhouse voices drifted in on the night air, low and tired. A horse blew softly in the yard. Caleb asked if she wanted a bite before turning in. She said she had eaten well at Mrs. Kincaid's table and would rather set her hands to order while there was still a bit of light. He brought the lamp closer and stood ready to help where she needed him. She did not let him hover. She sent him to stack dry wood near the stove, to carry the worst of the ash out back, and to fetch a clean rag from a chest in the pantry. It felt like a dance. He moved when she asked and stepped away when she needed space. She liked that he understood the rhythm of work. When the kettles went quiet and the last pan was set to dry, Caleb showed her the water bucket with the tin dipper and the hook by the door where it belonged. He pointed to the triangle bell that hung from a beam and said she could use that to call men to supper or to the yard in a hurry. He told her the nearest creek ran behind the house beyond the cottonwoods and that the wind came from the west most afternoons, so she should mind the fire door when it gusted. Lila stood in the center of the room and took it in. The stove ready, the table wiped, the shelves neat. It was not beautiful in the way of towns. It was honest and strong. It was a place where a woman could make something that mattered 3 times a day. She asked again, more precisely now that she had seen the place, how early the men stirred. Caleb said first light and no later. He added that his father took coffee black, that Jamie Pike drowned his in milk when there was any to be had, that Buck Tanner claimed beans kept a man upright in the saddle, and that old Jed said a biscuit should be light enough to shame pride. Lila stored those small pieces of information the way she had stored peaches and flour, knowing they would serve her well. Caleb asked if she would be all right through the night. She said she had a lock on the door and a strong back, and that was plenty. He nodded, picked up the empty buckets, and said he would see her in the morning. When he stepped out, the sound of his boots on the back steps faded into the cricket song. Lila pressed her palm once to the cool iron of the stove, then to the ring in her pocket, and then to the edge of the table where breakfast would be served. She was tired, but it was a good tired, the kind that gives rest meaning. She cracked the window of her little room and let the prairie air drift in. The smell of smoke and cut hay and far cattle settled over her like a blanket. Somewhere a night bird called. She unpinned her hair and lay down fully clothed on the narrow bed. The last thing she saw before sleep took her was the square of sky in the window. It looked too wide to be held by 4 small panes of glass. She fell asleep thinking that a life may be small in its pieces, yet wide in its purpose. Morning would come with first light, and she would be ready for it. The air in the kitchen still carried the faint tang of ashes and boiled beans when Caleb Rowan leaned his shoulder against the doorframe. His voice was steady but not demanding. "They'll be expecting coffee and breakfast by 5, he said. Then his green eyes rested on her face, searching. "I know it's asking a lot. Starting tomorrow." Lila Porter straightened from where she crouched, sorting through the battered pans. "I'll manage," she answered, her voice calm. She had already set aside the pots too scarred to save, determined to bring order to this room. Her hands moved with quiet resolve, sleeves rolled high, muscles aching but unwilling to yield. "Caleb," she asked after a moment, glancing up from a pot she was scouring, "where's the nearest creek if I need real washing?" "Rowan Creek runs just behind the house," he replied, pointing toward the cottonwoods beyond the yard. "About 50 yards, but we haul water into the kitchen for most everything." He paused then, his gaze sharpening. "Mrs. Porter about what I said in town." She looked up, cloth dripping in her hand. "Yes, when I told you gold isn't what we need," he said slowly, "I meant it. This place runs on work, not pretty tokens. Every man here has lost something. Every one of us has scars. What matters is the work we put in today, not what's gone." Her breath caught, but before she could form a reply, the door burst open. Boots scuffed the floorboards as a string of ranch hands filed in, drawn by the smell of hot water and the unexpected sight of a woman at the stove. They were a rough band faces, tanned and seamed, hands calloused from rope and rain. Their ages stretched wide, one tow-headed boy hardly more than 17, another with a beard silvered by 60 seasons. Dust clung to them like a second skin. "Boys," Caleb said firmly, voice carrying just enough authority to cut through the muttering. This is Mrs. Porter, our new cook. You'll mind your manners." The men shifted uneasily, pulling hats from their heads, mumbling greetings with a kind of awkward respect. The youngest, freckles spread across his nose, blurted out before he could stop himself, "Ma'am, does this mean we don't have to eat Buck's beans anymore?" A burly man with a thick mustache threw up his hands. "Now hold on, Jamie, my beans aren't that bad." Another voice, dry as dust, drawled from the back, "Your beans could shoe a mule." "Buck!" Laughter cracked through the tension. "All right, that's enough." The new voice came from the doorway, deeper and sharper. Silas Rowan had stepped inside. His presence drew the room taut in an instant. His weather-lined face missed nothing as his gaze swept the men. "Mrs. Porter has work to do," he said, the words simple but final. "Clear out and let her see to it. Supper's at 6. The ranch hands shuffled out, still chuckling under their breath. But Lila caught something in their eyes before they left hope, as raw and unspoken as hunger. When the room quieted again, she turned to Caleb. "Do we have coffee?" "They'll expect it at daybreak," he said. "I'll show you where it's kept." For the next hour he guided her through the cluttered kitchen. He showed her the tin where the beans were stored, the tricky way the stove's dampers drew best, which kettle boiled fast, and which pan was meant for frying. He was patient, steady, never hovering, but always near enough if she needed him. And as she worked, something inside her unknotted just a little. "Your mother," she asked at last, as she sprinkled salt over a salvaged pot. "She must have taught you these things. You move in a kitchen like you've been here before." His hand stilled on a jar of coffee beans. "Some," he admitted. "I was the youngest. Spent more time under her roof than my brothers. They all left during the war. None came back." His voice caught, but only for a moment. The war had taken more than men. It had taken fathers, sons, brothers. It had left women widowed, farms abandoned, towns with empty chairs at every table. Lila did not ask which side. Out here, the prairie did not care which flag a man had followed. Survival was the only measure now. By the time the sun had slipped below the horizon, the kitchen smelled of beans properly seasoned, salt pork fried crisp, and cornbread fresh from the oven. The meal wasn't fine by city standards, but it was hot, plentiful, and hers. At 6 sharp, boots thudded across the porch and the men filed back in, hats removed, expressions both eager and wary. They crowded the long table, waiting. Silas Rowan took the head seat, Caleb to his right. Lila served quickly, her hands steady even as her heart pounded. For a long breath, there was only silence. Then young Jamie Pike, cheeks flushed, let out a groan of delight. "Ma'am," he exclaimed, eyes wide. This is real food." "Eat it while it's hot," Lila said briskly, hiding the sudden warmth that rose in her chest. The men needed no second invitation. They dug in with the hunger of men who had gone too long without proper meals, scraping plates clean, passing dishes, looking toward her with unguarded gratitude. She had prepared more than enough, and even the extra platters vanished in minutes. When at last the table was cleared, Silas Rowan leaned back, wiping his mouth with a calloused hand. "That was a fine meal, Mrs. Porter," he said simply. "First we've had in too long." The other men murmured agreement. Caleb's eyes met hers, and in them she saw something deeper than thanks, something closer to trust. Later, as she stood at the wash basin, sleeves wet to the elbow, Caleb appeared at her side with a dish towel. "You don't have to," she began. "My mother never let anyone leave the kitchen without helping, he said, taking a plate from her hands. "No reason to change now." She smiled faintly and passed him another dish. "The men are already talking about breakfast," he added, drawing carefully. Jamie offered to wake early if it meant proper biscuits. "I'll see to the fire myself," she replied, "but I appreciate the offer." Still, she could not deny the small glow of pride inside her. It had been so long since her work had been welcomed, let alone praised. "You did well tonight," Caleb said quietly, stacking a plate. "I knew you would." She turned to him, eyebrow raised. "You knew nothing about me except that I was desperate enough to offer my wedding ring for bread. I knew you still carried yourself with pride, even when you were hungry," he answered. "I knew you guarded that ring like it meant more than coin. I knew you didn't beg, even when it might have gotten you fed. People show themselves in the hard moments. Mrs. Porter. What I saw in that store was someone who would bend, but not break." The word settled inside her, warming the coldest corners of her heart. She turned back to the sink, unwilling to let him see how close she was to tears. Fine words. "Mr. Rowan," she said briskly, "but I'm only a cook now. Nothing more." "There's nothing wrong with honest work," he answered, his voice steady. "And please, just Caleb. Mr. Rowan is my father." They finished the dishes side by side in companionable silence. When the last plate was dried and set aside, he slipped a hand into his vest pocket and drew something out. A small bunch of prairie wildflowers, already wilting from the ride, their petals pale lavender and gold. "Picked these on the way back from town," he said almost shyly. "Thought maybe your room could use them. My ma always kept flowers in the house." For a moment she could not speak. The gesture was so unexpected, so gentle from this quiet man. Her throat tightened. She reached out, taking the blossoms carefully, as if they might crumble. "Thank you, Caleb." He nodded, stepped toward the door, then paused. His eyes met hers once more. "Mrs. Porter, when you said you were only a cook, you're wrong. You're someone who chose to rise out of the ashes of what was, instead of lying down in them. That takes more courage than most folks ever find." The words lingered in the kitchen long after he left, as fragrant and fragile as the wildflowers in her hand. When Caleb left, the kitchen felt larger than before, as if the quiet itself were a kind of welcome. Lila Porter stood a moment with the small bouquet in her hands, prairie flowers already soft around the edges from his pocket. Through the window, she could make out a scatter of lamplight from the bunkhouse and hear the low rise and fall of men's voices. A rumble followed now and then by a quick burst of laughter. Overhead, the sky deepened until the first stars pricked through. There were more of them than she had ever seen back in Missouri, so many that looking up felt like tipping into a deep well. She rinsed a jar, dried it with her apron, and set the flowers in a little water on the window ledge in her narrow room. When she unpinned her hair, the muscles in her neck protested, a reminder of hours spent at the stove and sink. Her hand went to her pocket without thinking, closing around the ring that had once stood for a different future. She caught herself thinking how Henry Talbot would have sized up Caleb Rowan. Henry had admired plain talk and steady hands. He would have liked Caleb's quiet way and the kind of kindness that did not make a person feel small. The thought did not cut her open the way such thoughts had for months. It ached, but the ache felt older and less sharp, like a bruise settling into yellow. 4 comes early on any ranch, and earlier still for a cook. Lila woke in the dark to the rooster across the yard, pulled on her dress, tied her apron, and eased into the cold kitchen. She coaxed flame from the banked coals with a patience born of many mornings, then fed the fire until the iron belly of the stove glowed warm. Coffee beans crackled in the mill, and the first pot began to sigh. She worked biscuit dough in a wooden bowl until it turned smooth and soft under her palms. The oven held heat just right when she slid the first pan in. Another pan took up sliced potatoes. Salt pork hissed in the skillet and sent a welcome scent through the room. Footsteps sounded on the porch, and a knock came on the door jamb. Jamie Pike leaned in, hair sticking every which way, eyes bright with hope. "Morning, Mom. Is that coffee? It will be ready when you are," Lila said, keeping her voice brisk. "Breakfast at 5 means breakfast at 5, not a breath before." The corners of her mouth softened into a small smile, and Jamie grinned like the boy he still was, then darted back outside to wait with the others. At 5 exactly, she set the door wide and said, "Breakfast is on." The men filed in with a kind of order that had been missing the night before. Each took his place as if the long table remembered them. Caleb Rowan passed her on his way to his seat, and she noticed his shirt already dusted with hay and horsehair. "Morning chores," he said, when he caught her eye. The horses do not care what hour a man wants to sleep. Lila moved quickly and sure. She split biscuits and ladled gravy made from last night's drippings. She set out fried potatoes and thick slices of pork. Coffee cups filled and emptied and filled again. The first pot vanished so fast she set a second to boil before she could pour herself even a small cup. Between bites, Silas Rowan split a biscuit and looked toward her. "Mrs. Porter, where did you learn to turn out biscuits like that?" "My mother taught me back in Ohio," she said, then added, "and my husband." She paused and let the last word pass quietly into the steam of the room. "A woman learns what she must." "We are grateful for what you learned," said Jedediah Cole, an older hand whose face wore more lines than a dry riverbed. "My own mother's kitchen did not set lighter bread." The praise warmed her better than coffee. The men rose one by one when plates were clean. Chairs pushed back with a scrape. Hats tugged down as they reached the door. Buck Tanner patted the side of his stomach and declared he had never been so ready to mend fence. Jamie promised to split kindling without being asked. Work waited for them in pastures and at the corrals, and they stepped into it with a lighter step than the night before. Caleb lingered near the stove as the others filed out. "The supply wagon heads to Dry Creek at week's end," he said. "Make a list of what you need. Pay already told me to get whatever makes your work easier." "That is generous," she said. "It is practical," he answered. "Good food keeps good hands." He paused in the doorway. "There is a milk cow in the barn. We call her Mabel. She is gentle enough. If you want fresh milk for cooking, I can show you where she stands for milking after supper." "I will take you up on that," Lila said. When the kitchen emptied, she worked in a rhythm that quickly felt like it had always been her own. Dishes washed and set to dry. Pans scrubbed and stacked by size. The larder checked again with careful eyes. She noted the jars of dried beans, the sacks of flour and cornmeal, the strip of pork that would need careful tending in warm weather, the small store of coffee, the precious sugar. In the cellar she counted potatoes and onions, lifted the lid on a crock of pickles, and checked the seal on summer peaches. Up the back steps and out the door she found a square of ground behind the house that had once been a kitchen garden. Weeds had made a claim, but under the mat of green she saw the old rows and the outline of a bed that had likely grown herbs. She pushed a stick into the soil. It turned rich under the top crust. Work would reclaim it. By noon she had packed a basket with cold biscuits, slices of cheese, and thin-cut strips of dried beef. She added a jar of pickles from the crock and wrapped it in a cloth so it would not rattle. She tied the whole with twine and rang the small triangle by the back door to call someone to carry lunch out. She had learned from Jamie that the men rarely came all the way back for midday. The spread of work was too far. The food had to go to them. Caleb arrived a few minutes later, shirt dark at the collar, hair damp with sweat. He lifted the basket one-handed as if it weighed nothing and grinned in a brief, almost surprised way. "They will be grateful," he said. Buck usually throws hardtack in a sack and calls it good. "Hardtack," she repeated with a shudder. No wonder they were pleased last night over simple beans. He laughed, a rusty sound, as if the last time had been a while. "Mom, you could serve them boot leather, and they would thank you so long as it was not Buck's cooking. I will aim a higher pitch than boot leather," she said. The laugh came easier the second time. He tipped his hat, then crossed the yard with the basket and climbed the fence like a boy, before dropping to the other side. The afternoon settled into the kind of steady work that clears the mind. She washed the last of the breakfast pans and set them to dry along the windowsill so that the sun warmed them. She wiped down the shelves and labeled jars in a neat hand so she would not waste time hunting later. She made notes on a scrap of paper for the Dry Creek list: good coffee beans, baking soda, more salt, a spool of twine, fresh yeast if the storekeeper had any, and not the old gray cakes that never rose, a bolt of clean muslin for straining broth or covering dough, a small tin of pepper. She put a star beside that one. Pepper made beans into supper. Her mind turned, too, to the garden. Come first thaw, she would want seed. She wrote down the shapes of what she hoped for, even if supplies were thin this late in the season. Onion sets, if anyone in town had saved them back. A small packet of carrots. Something green for early pots. She thought of the herb bed, a kitchen that held time, and sage could make beans taste like company food. She took a clean bucket to the pump and carried it back in under one arm to refill the water crock by the door. The movement of it felt good in her shoulders. Work had a way of stitching a person back together from the inside. The rhythm of it settled thoughts that had run wild for months. Toward mid-afternoon, a lay of cloud dimmed the sun, and a cool breath came through the cottonwoods. Lila used the quiet hour to mend a torn apron and baste a seam on her spare dress. She kept an ear tuned to the yard. She could tell the difference already between the clatter of tack and the thud of a hay fork, between the voices of men trading jokes and the calls they used to move cattle. The ranch had its own music, and she was learning the notes. By late day she set a small start for the evening meal. Beans began to swell in fresh water. She cut salt pork in even pieces and browned them off to one side. She saved the fat for cornbread and left the crisp bits for the men who liked to steal from the pan when they passed through. A kettle of water sat ready to pour when the coffee time came. She measured out flour and set a bowl where it would be at hand later. Just as she wiped her hands on her apron and reached for the door to fetch more wood, horses sounded on the far side of the yard. Not the purposeful in and out of chores, but a different cadence entirely. 3 riders drew up near the barn. Their mounts carried dust and miles. Voices drifted closer, lower than the easy banter she had grown used to hearing around the place. Unexpected company, she thought, setting her palm flat on the cool wood of the table. She could not see their faces from the kitchen window, only the tilt of worn hats and the way men sit a saddle when they have done it since boyhood. In a moment, she heard Caleb Rowan call out to them, his tone even and polite as far as she could tell. Footsteps moved toward the house. Lila put the kettle back on the heat and straightened the towel across the counter. Ranches breathe in the usual and the sudden alike. She had learned that much already. Whatever this was, she would meet it the way she had met everything since she stepped from the wagon, with her chin up, her hands steady, and the stove warm. Lila Porter was scrubbing the long kitchen table when the sound of hooves cut through the afternoon quiet. She stilled, rag in hand, listening, more than one horse. A moment later, voices drifted in, Caleb Rowan's familiar tone among them, deeper than the rest. She wiped her palms on her apron and stepped toward the window. 3 riders had drawn up in the yard, their mounts caked with dust, the look of men who had traveled far without stopping. The door swung open, and Caleb entered with 2 of them. The third stayed behind to mind the horses. "Mrs. Porter," Caleb said, giving her a small nod. "These men are looking for work. Thought they should know we've got a proper cook in this kitchen now." His tone carried quiet pride, almost a warning at the edges. Then to the strangers, he added, "Mrs. Porter keeps this kitchen. What she says here goes." The taller man stepped forward. A long scar split his left eyebrow, making one eye look keener than the other. He tipped his hat, his gaze raking over her in a way that made her spine stiffen. "Ma'am," he drawled, "name's Wade. This here's Collins." The other gave a curt nod. Trail-worn both, with the guarded air of men who had lived rough. Something about Wade's steady, measuring look unsettled her, but she returned the courtesy. "The hands eat at 6, she said evenly. "Those who work eat." Wade's smile flickered, but did not warm his eyes. "Fair enough. Been a long time since we've had home cooking." They moved back out with Caleb, but when the door closed behind them, Lila found her hands trembling against the scrubbed wood. She gripped the table's edge, angry with herself. She had dealt with men of all kinds back in Henry's store in Missouri, drifters, traders, farmers who smelled of whiskey. But something about Wade's look carried a weight she did not trust. Alone here, the awareness of her vulnerability pressed sharp. A gentle knock broke her thoughts. Caleb leaned against the frame, concern etched into the lines around his eyes. "You all right, fine," she answered too quickly, then forced herself to add, "They unsettled me." He stepped inside and shut the door with quiet finality. "Trust your instincts," he said. "I'm not sure about them either, but we need men for roundup. I'll make sure they understand the rules. Anyone bothers you, they're gone." The firmness in his voice steadied her more than she expected. "Thank you," she murmured. He ran a hand through his hair, almost embarrassed. "Ma would tan my hide if I didn't look after folks under this roof. That means something here." Before she could reply, he was gone, back to work. But his words lingered, another ember warming the cold place she had carried for months. That evening, the 3 newcomers sat at the table with the rest. Wade and Collins ate with hearty appreciation, though their eyes roamed the room, measuring walls and men alike. The third, introduced as Doyle, said little and kept his gaze lowered. The older hands were cautious. Conversation clipped where it had been easy the night before. Only young Jamie Pike carried on, chattering about fence lines and runaway calves until even the plainest tasks sounded like grand adventures. And then the wire snapped back and near caught Sam right in the mind your tongue. Jedediah Cole cut in firmly, sending Lila a quick, apologetic glance. The boy flushed crimson and ducked his head. "Sorry, ma'am." Supper ended with fewer laughs than usual, the scrape of chairs louder in the quiet. Later, Caleb kept his promise. He led her to the barn, lantern swinging between them. Inside, the air smelled of hay and warm hide. In one stall, a broad brown and white cow turned calm eyes toward her. "This here's Mabel," Caleb said, "gentle as they come." He showed her how to step close, hands steady on the flank, how to sit and draw the milk with patience. Foam rose in the pail, the rhythm of it peaceful. Ma always said milking was thinking time. He told her, a quiet kind of work. She used to claim a day could start wrong, but milking set it right. Lila stroked the cow's warm side. "Your mother sounds like she was wise." She was. His voice carried an ache carefully folded away. "This place isn't the same without her. Pa does what he can, but there are things a woman sees that men never think on. Small touches, beauty, comfort." He waved a hand vaguely toward the rafters. Curtains on a window, flowers on the table. She made it feel like more than a place to drop, eat, and rise again. Lila thought of the wilted bouquet on her windowsill. "Is that why you brought those flowers yesterday?" Color touched the planes of his face, and he glanced aside. "Maybe. Seemed like something she'd want me to do." They stood together in the dim barn. The only sounds Mabel's slow breathing and the whisper of hay settling. The silence was companionable, not the sharp kind that cut with loneliness. "I should get back," Layla said at last. "Morning comes early. I'll walk you." The house was only steps away, but she did not protest. They crossed the yard under a sky ablaze with stars, the prairie wind brushing cool against their faces, carrying with it the smell of grass and the faint tang of distant rain. At the kitchen door, Caleb stopped. His voice was softer than usual when he spoke. "Mrs. Porter, Lila." Her name in his mouth felt different, careful and considered. "I'm glad you're here. We all are." She looked up at him. This man who had offered her work when she had been stripped of nearly everything, who had given her dignity when others might have offered only charity. "I'm beginning to be glad, too," she said quietly. A true smile broke across his face then, rare and transforming. "Good," he said simply. "That's good." He left her at the door. She stood a moment in the quiet kitchen, her kitchen now, she realized, and felt a surprising swell inside her. Not belonging, not yet, but the possibility of it, like seeds hidden beneath the soil, waiting for warmth. She thought of Henry, of the life they had imagined together, the shop they would have run, the children they never got to raise. That path lay behind her now, buried in Missouri soil. But as she stood there with flour under her nails and Caleb's smile lingering in her mind, she realized there might be another life waiting. Not a replacement, but something new, something different that could grow strong if given half a chance. Tomorrow there would be chores before dawn, more meals to cook, more hands to feed, the steady rhythm of keeping men alive in a harsh land. But tonight, for the first time in months, it didn't feel like survival. It felt like a beginning. The days that followed slipped into a rhythm as steady as the tick of a clock. Every morning before the first streak of light touched the horizon, Lila Porter was already on her feet. Her hands grew familiar with the old iron stove's moods, knowing just how much kindling it needed to catch and how to coax a steady blaze. She could feel in her palms the exact moment dough turned supple enough for biscuits and measure by sight the amount of coffee strong enough to raise tired cowboys from their beds. It was harder work than she had ever known in Missouri, harder than tallying accounts or helping Henry weigh bolts of cloth in the store. Yet there was satisfaction in seeing empty plates come back to her table, in hearing the men murmur their thanks around mouths still full of hot bread. Her cheeks lost their hollow look. Her frame filled back out with strength, and the tremor that hunger had once given her hands disappeared. Her skin browned beneath her bonnet until she hardly recognized the pale woman who had stumbled across Rowan Ranch that first day. The past self, the merchant's wife in carefully pressed dresses, slipped further away with every sunrise. In her place, someone new was being shaped by calluses, by sun and wind, by work that demanded all of her and gave back a sense of purpose in return. It was a sweltering Tuesday when everything shifted again. The prairie shimmered with heat, the air above the grass wavering like water. Lila was in the kitchen, arms dusted with flour, kneading bread with a steady rhythm. The slam of the back door startled her, and Jamie Pike came skidding across the floor, his face white. "Mrs. Porter, hurry, Caleb's horse threw him." The dough dropped from her fingers as she bolted after the boy. They ran toward the corral, where a knot of men circled. She forced her way through, her heart hammering. There sat Caleb Rowan, propped against the fence rail, his face pale under the sunburn, his left arm clutched tight to his chest. "Just a disagreement with a green colt," he muttered between clenched teeth. "Nothing broken." But Lila saw the unnatural angle of his shoulder, the way his jaw tightened against the pain. Without hesitation, she dropped to her knees beside him, her hands steady as she touched the joint. "Dislocated," she said firmly. The men shifted, surprise written on their faces. Her father had been a doctor before drink carried him to ruin. But in her girlhood she had learned more than society said a woman should about bones and fevers and broken bodies. She knew what needed to be done. "It has to be set back in place," she told Caleb. "It'll hurt." His green eyes found hers, full of something that made her breath catch. Trust. Do it. She sent Jamie running for a bottle of whiskey and clean cloth. When he returned, she positioned herself behind Caleb, planting her feet. The hands crowded closer, curious but wary. She set her hands firmly around his arm, remembering her father's voice guiding her. On 3, she warned. 1, 2. She moved on 2, a sharp, sure pull and twist. There was an audible pop as the joint slipped back into place. Caleb's whole body went rigid, a strangled sound escaping his throat. "Mercy, Lord," breathed Jedediah Cole. "Where in blazes did you learn that my father," Lila said shortly, "already fashioning a sling from the cloth. Keep it bound. No heavy work for a few days." Color was coming back into Caleb's face, the worst of the pain fading. His good hand caught hers as she adjusted the knot. "Thank you." The touch lasted only a moment, but it sent heat rushing up her arm. She pulled back quickly, brushing dust from her skirts. "You need rest. Jamie, walk him to the house." But Caleb shook his head, stubborn as stone. "I'll walk myself." And he did, though every step was measured and careful. Lila followed, ignoring the sidelong glances and knowing smirks from the men. That evening she carried a tray to his room, the first time she had been beyond the kitchen and her own narrow quarters. His chamber was plain but tidy, a narrow bed, a washstand, and a shelf of books worn soft at the edges. Caleb sat propped on pillows, awkwardly trying to cut meat with one hand. "Let me," she said, taking the plate from him. "I'm no invalid," he protested. "No," she answered dryly. "You're a stubborn fool who'll tear that shoulder trying to prove otherwise." With quick strokes she sliced the meat into small pieces. "There. Now you can eat and keep your pride." His laugh surprised them both. "You sound like Ma. She never tolerated foolishness." "Then she was a wise woman," Lila replied, settling into the chair beside him. "Tell me about her." The light slanted golden through the small window as he spoke. Margaret Rowan had been a school teacher from Pennsylvania before she married Silas Rowan and crossed the plains. She brought with her books, and the belief that civilization started at the dinner table. Even during roundup, she insisted on proper meals and made her sons practice their letters at night, no matter how tired they were. She'd say, "You'll thank me someday," Caleb recalled, a half smile tugging his mouth. And she was right. I just wish I'd told her so more often. The warmth in his tone softened the room, even as grief lingered beneath it. As the shadows lengthened, Lila studied him in the quiet. The lines around his eyes, carved by sun and laughter. The set of his jaw, stubborn yet not unkind. His dark blonde hair had fallen across his forehead, untamed. He was handsome, not in any polished way, but in the honest look of a man shaped by wind and work. "You're staring," he said softly. Heat rushed into her cheeks. "I was thinking you need a haircut." His lips curved with gentle amusement. "That's so you offering." "Perhaps," she teased, finding boldness. "Can't have you looking like a wild man at the table. Heaven forbid." He shifted, wincing. Then his voice grew serious. "Lila, can I ask you something?" She nodded, though her pulse quickened. "Your husband, do you miss him?" The question hung heavy in the quiet room. She sat back, her breath slow, searching for truth. "I miss what we were," she said at last. "The life we planned. The future I thought was certain, but the sharpness of it, it's fading. Sometimes I feel guilty for that." Caleb's gaze was steady. "My ma used to say grief is like a prairie fire. At first it burns everything in sight, but then, in the ashes, new growth starts. Doesn't mean what was lost didn't matter. Just means life keeps on." "Your mother sounds like she was filled with wisdom," Lila whispered. "She was full of something," Caleb said, a small grin tugging at his mouth. Pa always called it Irish stubbornness. She smiled back before she could stop herself. "And did you inherit it? Why do you think I tried to ride that colt before he was ready?" She laughed then, free and unguarded. The sound surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. He looked at her differently, something unspoken sparking between them. His good hand shifted toward hers, where it rested on the chair arm, stopping just short. The air between them felt alive, carrying more than the scent of supper. For a long moment neither spoke. Outside, the prairie wind rattled the shutters, and the day gave way to night. Inside, in that small plain room, Lila felt the first stirrings of something she had thought burned to ash forever. "Lila," Caleb said quietly, his voice low and rough in the fading light. He had been about to say more when a call from downstairs broke the moment. "Mrs. Porter," Jamie Pike's young voice carried up the stairwell. "Sorry to bother, but Collins is asking about seconds, and Buck told me to tell you. I'll be right there," she called back, rising quickly from the chair. She turned to Caleb, her cheeks flushed. "You need to rest. I'll send Jamie up with anything else you want." She slipped out before he could answer, her pulse racing, the air in her lungs too tight. In the safety of the kitchen, she pressed her palms flat against the cool wood of the table. She knew she was in dangerous waters. She was a widow, a hired cook, living under the goodwill of the Rowan family. Caleb was more than her employer. He was a decent man who deserved a woman not weighed down by loss and memory, not one still carrying her husband's ring in her pocket. And yet, there was the way he said her name, careful and warm, the way he kept a respectful distance while his eyes spoke truths he hadn't yet put to words. "Mrs. Porter," Jamie's head appeared in the doorway, worry in his freckled face. "Everything all right. Just fine." she said briskly, turning to the stove. "Tell Collins he can have seconds if he splits tomorrow's kindling." Jamie's grin flashed. "Yes, ma'am. That'll fix him." The following days found Caleb restless, limited to light duties while his shoulder healed. He hated standing idle. That much was plain. But Lila watched his color return, the pain lines ease. By the week's end, he was back in the saddle, though she noticed he still favored his right side when he thought no one was looking. It was a Sunday afternoon when things changed again. The ranch was quiet. Most of the hands in Dry Creek and Silas Rowan off visiting a neighbor. Lila knelt in the kitchen garden, dirt staining her skirts, her hands deep in the soil she had been reclaiming row by row. The sound of hooves reached her before she saw him. Caleb appeared, leading 2 saddled horses. His expression carried a hint of mischief. "Thought you might want to see more of the ranch," he said. She glanced down at her dirt-smeared apron and stray strands of hair sticking loose. "I'm hardly dressed for riding." "You're dressed just fine," he countered. "Come on, Lila." "The weeds will wait." Something in his tone close to pleading, though not quite, made her untie her apron. She hadn't been on a horse since Missouri, but muscle memory stirred as he helped her mount the gentle mare. They rode side by side across the wide prairie, silence comfortable between them. Caleb pointed out the creek that cut their eastern border, the stand of cottonwoods where cattle were driven during storms, the hill that held the family graves. They dismounted there, standing before 3 plain wooden crosses. Wildflowers, hardy and stubborn, grew between them. "She'd like what you've done with the kitchen," Caleb said softly, "like having life back in the house." "It's only cooking," Lila said, her voice uncertain. "No." He turned fully toward her, the weight of his gaze steady. "It's more than that. You've brought something this place had lost. The men feel it. Pa feels it." He stopped, jaw tightening, as though the rest of the words resisted leaving him. "Caleb," she said gently, "I know you're still grieving. I know I've no right to." He drew a breath and cut in. "I just need you to understand. Seeing you laugh with Jamie, hearing you sing to the hens, watching you gentle Mabel as though you'd done it your whole life. It's the first time Rowan Ranch has felt like home since Ma passed." The words came raw and unpolished, but true. Lila felt tears sting her eyes. "I don't know if I'm ready," she whispered. "I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. "Only that you know you're not just the cook to me. You're—" His hand lifted helplessly. "You're becoming everything." Something broke open inside her then. Something she had held shut since Henry died. She stepped closer, close enough to see the gold flecks in his green eyes. Her hand lifted of its own accord, brushing his cheek. "I'm scared," she admitted. "So am I," he answered, covering her hand with his own, rough with calluses yet warm. "But maybe being scared together is better than pretending to be brave alone." Henry's face flickered through her mind, but not with the sharp pain she had dreaded. Instead, she heard his voice as she remembered it, gentle and steady. "Be happy, Liza. That's all I ever wanted for you. Maybe," she breathed, and Caleb's face lit with tentative hope. They rode back as the sun sank low, painting the sky in amber fire. They didn't touch, but the air between them seemed alive, humming with something new. At the house he helped her dismount, his hands lingering a heartbeat too long at her waist. "Thank you," she said softly, "for showing me, for reminding me." He gave a small nod, understanding without her finishing the thought. Always, that night, in the privacy of her small room, Lila did something she had not done since Henry Talbot slipped the ring onto her finger. She slid it off. For a long moment she held the band up to the lamplight, this small circle of gold that had once meant forever. She didn't hide it away, not yet, but set it on the washstand instead of carrying it into sleep. It was a small change, but small changes had power, like wildflowers blooming after prairie fire. They were the first signs of life returning, fragile yet stubborn enough to reach for the sun. The following morning carried the crisp bite of autumn. Lila pulled her shawl tight as she walked back from the henhouse, eggs rattling gently in the basket. The prairie grass had turned to gold, catching the light of the rising sun until the whole horizon glowed amber. "Festival starts Saturday," Jamie blurted at breakfast, his excitement bouncing him in his chair. "There'll be pie contests and dancing." "Sit still before you spill your plate," Jed Cole scolded, though his weathered face betrayed amusement. "You sound 10 years old again." "Let him be glad," Lila said, refilling coffee cups. "When's the last time any of you had cause to celebrate?" The men traded looks, silent acknowledgement passing between them. 2 years had slipped by since Margaret Rowan's death. 2 years since Rowan Ranch had joined in the town festival. But lately, a new lightness had touched the place, as though grief was finally loosening its grip. "Mrs. Porter's right," Silas Rowan said from the head of the table. "It's time we stopped living as though we're still in mourning." Margaret wouldn't want that. His gaze moved down the table to his son. "You'll escort Mrs. Porter to the festival." It wasn't really a question. Silas Rowan's words carried the weight of a decision already made. Caleb's ears turned red, but he nodded once. "If she's willing." All eyes turned toward Lila Porter. Heat rose in her cheeks, but she forced her voice to stay even. "I suppose I could use some supplies from town." Jamie Pike let out a whoop, which earned him a sharp look from Jed Cole. But the boy only ducked his head, grinning. The damage was done. The mood in the dining room had lifted, a current of anticipation sparking like lightning before a summer storm. Over the next few days, Rowan Ranch buzzed with energy. The men argued about which horses to bring, who would compete in the roping contest, and whether Buck Tanner's notorious corn liquor would sneak its way into the gathering. Even the new hands weighed with his scar, Collins with his sharp eyes, and quiet Doyle seemed caught up in the excitement, though Lila couldn't shake her unease around them. For her part, Lila felt both eager and anxious. It had been more than a year since she'd stood among neighbors at any social affair, and never had she done so as a woman alone. Well, not alone exactly. Everyone in Dry Creek already knew she cooked for Rowan Ranch. Most had likely guessed at the bond forming between her and Caleb. Gossip had a way of moving faster than the wind across prairie grass. The night before the festival, Lila stood before the small mirror in her room, holding up her 2 dresses. Both were serviceable wool, cut plain for a merchant's wife in mourning. Neither seemed suited for fiddle music and lantern light, for pies and laughter, for the way Caleb sometimes looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. A gentle knock broke her thoughts. "Come in," she called. To her surprise, it was Silas Rowan. He stepped inside, carrying a wooden box. "This belonged to Margaret," he said gruffly. "Been sitting in a trunk doing no good. She'd want it worn." Inside lay a dress of deep blue calico scattered with small white flowers. Simple but lovely. Beneath it rested a pair of soft kid gloves and ribbon ties meant for hair. "Mr. Rowan." "I couldn't." "You can and you will," he said firmly, though his eyes were kind. "My boy's been lighter in spirit these past months than I've seen him in years." That's because of you. Margaret would want you to have something fine to wear." Lila's throat tightened, emotion threatening to steal her words. She managed only a whisper. "Thank you." At the door, Silas hesitated. "Lila, Caleb's a good man, but he holds back more than he should. He's been hurt, though he'd never speak of it. Don't let him hide behind that caution. Life's too short for walls." After he left, Lila lifted the dress against herself. Margaret Rowan had been of similar build. The thought of wearing a dead woman's gown to court her son should have felt strange, even morbid. Instead, it felt like a blessing, an offering of welcome into a family. Saturday dawned crisp and clear, the kind of autumn morning that promised fair skies. The ranch hands rode off early, some mounted, others perched on the supply wagon, their voices carried across the yard, full of easy cheer. Caleb stayed behind, hitching up the buggy so he and Lila could follow with the baked goods. She rose earlier than usual, baking 2 pies, a pan of biscuits, and packing a jar of plum preserve she'd made from fruit she discovered near the creek. When at last she stepped from her room, Margaret's blue dress smoothing around her frame, ribbons pinning up her hair, Caleb was already waiting outside. He turned, saw her, and stilled. The rein slipped from his hand unnoticed. His expression was one of surprise, almost wonder. "You look—" He cleared his throat and tried again. "You look beautiful." Warmth spread through her chest, stronger than the shawl draped around her shoulders. Your mother had lovely taste. At that, his shoulders eased. She'd be glad to see it worn. She always said pretty things ought to be used, not tucked away. He helped her into the buggy with careful hands, and they set off toward Dry Creek. The ride was quiet at first, the rattle of wheels and the steady clip of hooves filling the silence. Both of them felt the weight of what this day meant. At length Caleb spoke. "I should warn you. Folks will talk about you being there with me." "Let them talk," she replied simply. He glanced sideways at her, surprise in his eyes and something more behind it. "You sure?" Lila thought about it, about propriety, about the way small-town gossip could cling. Then she thought of the morning she now woke with purpose, of Jamie's laughter, Jed's quiet approval, and the way Caleb's smile made her feel like the earth beneath her feet was steady again. "I'm sure," she said. Dry Creek had been transformed. Lanterns hung from storefronts, waiting to be lit once the sun dropped. Long tables were already laden with food pumpkin pies, roasted chickens, loaves of bread, jars of preserves. The sound of a fiddle carried over the din, its bright notes announcing the cleared square that would serve as a dance floor. Children darted between legs, their shouts like sparrows in spring. As Lila stepped down from the buggy, she felt the weight of eyes upon her. Whispers followed. "That's her, the widow Porter with the Rowan boy, the one who nearly traded her ring for bread." Lila found herself judging the pie contest, diplomatically awarding the minister's wife first place, watching the roping competition where Caleb earned second, losing only to a cowboy from Double Bar Ranch. She met what felt like half the county, her name spoken again and again as though she truly belonged here. By evening, the lanterns were lit, casting the town square in golden light. Couples moved to the lively rhythm of the fiddle, skirts swirling, boots striking dust into the air. Lila stood at the edge, watching. Once, long ago, she had loved to dance. Henry's hand on hers, laughter in their eyes, the future bright ahead. Now she only watched, hands clasped before her, heart uncertain. "May I have this dance?" She turned. Caleb stood before her, his hand extended, his jacket gone, his white shirt glowing in the lantern light. His eyes were steady, his voice quiet, but sure. Lila hesitated only a heartbeat before laying her hand in Caleb Rowan's. Henry's hand on hers, laughter in their eyes, the future bright ahead. Now she only watched, hands clasped before her, heart uncertain. "May I have this dance?" She turned. Caleb stood before her, his hand extended, his jacket gone, his white shirt glowing in the lantern light. His eyes were steady, his voice quiet, but sure. Lila hesitated only a heartbeat before laying her hand in Caleb Rowan's. The warmth of his touch coursed through her, steady and grounding, and yet it left her breathless. He guided her toward the lantern-lit square as the fiddler shifted into a slower waltz. His palm rested respectfully at her waist, his other hand enclosing hers. They moved in careful rhythm, the dust rising around their boots like a soft veil. "I should warn you," he said, the corners of his mouth twitching. "I'm no expert on the dance floor." "You're doing fine," Lila assured him, finding herself smiling despite the knots in her stomach. He moved with the same quiet certainty he brought to work with horses, as if the music were simply another current of life to follow. "My ma always said a man who couldn't dance was only half civilized," Caleb admitted, his thumb brushing her palm. It might have been an accident, but the touch sent another shiver through her. "I haven't had much cause to practice lately." The tune carried them across the packed earth. Couples swirled past, skirts flaring and boots striking in time, but Lila barely noticed them. The world narrowed to Caleb's steady green eyes fixed on her face. For the first time in months, she forgot to guard her heart. "Lila," he said softly. Her pulse quickened. "Yes." He spun her neatly, buying himself a moment, then drew her back. His voice was low, nearly lost beneath the fiddle. "I was engaged once before." She stumbled, but he steadied her. Her name was Catherine. She was from up north, daughter of a rancher, pretty, smart, everything a man thought he wanted. But when she spent time at Rowan Ranch, she saw what this life really meant. Loneliness, hard work, the kind of uncertainty that stretches year to year. She left before the wedding, said she couldn't bury herself in the wilderness for any man. His jaw tightened at the memory. "I tell you this because I need you to understand. What I feel for you, it isn't loneliness. It isn't convenience. When you hum in the kitchen, when you handle Mabel like you've always known her, when you stand your ground with Wade, you're not just enduring this life. You're thriving in it. You're making it better. You're making me better." The music ended, but they didn't move, locked in each other's gaze while the dancers swept around them. Lila lifted her hand to his cheek, feeling the rough stubble beneath her palm. "I'm not Catherine," she whispered. "No," he said, covering her hand with his. "You're Lila, and that's everything." A pointed cough broke their moment. Jamie Pike stood a few feet away, grinning from ear to ear. "They're striking up another tune. If you two are done staring, there's dancing to be had." Caleb flushed scarlet, but Lila laughed a sound that startled her with its brightness. "One more dance," she told Caleb, her eyes still shining. "One more," he agreed, though one became two, then three. Between songs, they talked quietly of the kitchen garden she was coaxing back to life, of Margaret Rowan's roses Lila was determined to revive, of the books on Caleb's shelf she had been meaning to borrow. Each word, each shared glance chipped away at the walls she'd built around her heart. When they finally paused, her feet sore but her spirit light, she felt as if some invisible weight had lifted. For the first time since Henry's death, She could breathe without grief choking her. The evening began to wind down, the tables of food picked over, lanterns burning lower. Lila was helping gather the leftovers when raised voices drew her attention. Near the dance floor, Wade and Collins stood toe-to-toe with two ranch hands from Double Bar. The reek of whiskey floated on the night air. "You were cheating," Wade slurred, his hand twitching dangerously near his hip. Caleb appeared as if summoned, stepping between them. "Problem here?" His voice was calm, but it carried authority. "No problem," Wade drawled, though his eyes were sharp as a blade. "Just explaining how things work." "The only thing you're explaining is how to get yourself fired," Caleb said evenly. "Walk it off. Both of you. Now." For a tense moment, the air hummed with the possibility of violence. Then Collins muttered something, tugging Wade's arm, and the pair backed off, stumbling toward the shadows. Lila came to Caleb's side, her voice low. "Trouble, maybe," he admitted. His eyes flickered toward Silas Rowan, who stood a few yards off, watching the scene with narrowed eyes. "Pa hired them. I'll talk to him. Tonight's not for worrying." He was right. The ride home was quiet, but it was the kind of silence that felt easy, as though the words that mattered had already been spoken. When they reached Rowan Ranch, Caleb helped her down from the buggy. His hands lingered at her waist. "Thank you," she said softly, "for the dancing, for telling me about Catherine, for everything." "Lila," he said, her name like a prayer. "May I?" As she breathed, he kissed her, gentle and careful, as though afraid she might vanish. She leaned into him, her hands resting on his shoulders, and felt a part of herself that had been frozen since Missouri began to thaw. When they parted, breathless, he pressed his forehead to hers. "I'll court you proper," he promised. "No matter how long it takes, I'll do this the right way. All I need," she whispered, "is for you to be yourself." Later in her small room, Lila unpinned her hair and carefully folded Margaret's dress on the washstand. Her wedding ring caught the lamplight, gleaming in its familiar circle. She lifted it, holding it a long moment in her palm. Then she opened the drawer of her washstand and set it inside, not discarded, not forgotten, but no longer binding her hand. She was ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. 3 days later, the first sign of real trouble appeared. Lila was hanging laundry behind the house when she noticed riders on the horizon. At first, she thought they were neighbors crossing the prairie, but their movements were wrong, slow, circling, like vultures measuring distance to a carcass. She shaded her eyes, counting 5, maybe 6. They rode along the eastern boundary before vanishing into the distance. That evening, Caleb's expression was grim as he stepped into the kitchen. Dust still clung to his shirt. "Someone cut the fence line," he said. "We lost about 20 head before we caught it." "Rustlers?" Silas Rowan asked from his place at the table. "Could be," Caleb answered. "Or someone wants us to think so." His gaze flicked, almost too quick to notice, toward the newcomers, Wade, Collins, and Doyle, sitting at the far end. Lila caught the doubt in his eyes, the careful watchfulness he couldn't quite hide. No one spoke for a long moment, the clatter of dishes and the low whistle of wind at the window filling the silence. Finally, Silas set down his fork. "We'll double the night guard, and I'll ride to town tomorrow to speak with Sheriff Dawson. Whoever's behind this will learn Rowan Ranch isn't easy pickings." The men murmured agreement, but tension clung to the air like smoke. Lila ladled stew into bowls, setting them before each man in turn. She felt Wade's eyes on her longer than was decent, a smirk tugging at his lips when she refused to meet his gaze. Collins leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Doyle, as always, said nothing. When the meal was done, Caleb walked her to the doorway, his voice pitched low. "Don't be alone with them. Not ever." She nodded, gripping her shawl tighter. The prairie wind had turned sharp with the season's change, but it was something else, a prickle of unease that raised gooseflesh on her arms. As the men headed out to set watch, Lila looked toward the horizon, where night swallowed the endless grass. She had found a home here, found purpose, even found a spark of love again. But the prairie had its own way of testing every promise, and she sensed this was only the beginning. Wade caught Caleb Rowan stare across the table and smirked, slow and mocking, before lowering his gaze back to his plate. The room eased into silence, but the unease did not leave. Over the next few days the tension coiled tighter, like storm clouds gathering on the wide Nebraska sky. First, it was another fence line, wire cut clean as a knife stroke. Then a water hole poisoned with a rotting coyote. Small harassments that sent the men out longer hours, eyes sharp, tempers short. Even the steady ones like Jed Cole kept glancing over their shoulders. "It's Clayton Mason," Jed muttered one evening, when only the old hands remained in the kitchen. His voice was low, but it carried weight. "Gotta be. Man's been eyeing this place for years." Caleb bristled, though his frustration was clear. "We can't prove it, and we can't fight shadows." Lila Porter poured coffee into mugs, listening from her usual corner. The kitchen smelled of bacon grease and wood smoke, a comfort against the hard words. Mason? The name alone carried menace. He owned Double Bar Ranch north of them, 3 times Rowan Ranch's size, built on fear and raw greed. She had heard the stories whispered in town hired thugs. Barns burned, neighbors forced to sell out for pennies when trouble found them. "Maybe that's the plan," she said suddenly. The men looked at her, surprised she'd spoken. She steadied her voice. "In my husband's store back in Missouri, we had a competitor who worked the same way. Small thefts, spoiled goods, nasty rumors whispered. While we scrambled, fixing one thing after another, he was negotiating to buy our mortgage. By the time we saw the truth, he owned us." She lifted her eyes to Caleb's. "What does Mason truly want?" "The whole valley," Silas Rowan said grimly from his seat at the head of the table. His lined face was carved with certainty. "Always has." "And what do we have that he doesn't?" Lila pressed. "The creek," Caleb answered after a beat. His eyes widened as the realization sank in. "Exactly," she said. "Not your cattle, not your fences, your water. If he takes that, the ranch dies on its own." Silence settled heavy across the room. The clatter of wind outside seemed suddenly louder, like the land itself listening. Later that night, Caleb walked her toward her quarters as had become their habit. These walks were quiet interludes, a brush of fingers when she passed him a plate, a stolen kiss under the stars, murmured words by her doorway, small pieces of something deeper, something fragile but growing. "You're clever," he told her softly, catching her hand. "You see what we missed." She managed a wry smile. "I've had practice watching for snakes. Sometimes they wear fine clothes, sometimes spurs. Doesn't make them less dangerous." He pulled her against him, and she let herself rest in the circle of his arms, breathing in the scent of dust and horses and the warmth that was uniquely his. "I worry," he admitted, his voice rough against her hair. "If Mason makes a real move, then we'll meet it," she said firmly. "Together." His arms tightened. He pulled back enough for her to see his face, and in his eyes was something that startled her fear, hope, and a tenderness so deep it ached. "I love you, Lila." The words were quiet, but they carried the force of thunder. Her breath caught. She searched his face, finding no jest, no hesitation, only truth. Her heart, fragile and mended, stuttered before finding its rhythm again. "I love you too." Joy lit his features like dawn breaking over the prairie. They might have lingered in that wonder forever, but the sound of pounding hooves broke the spell. Caleb stepped away, his hand flying to the colt at his side. A rider burst from the night peat, one of the younger cowhands. His horse was lathered, eyes rolling white. Boss Pete gasped. "Trouble at the creek. Rider's dozen, maybe more. Sam sent me." Caleb was already moving. Rouse the others, quietly. He turned to Lila, urgency in every line of him. "Get to the root cellar. Bar the door." "I can help," she whispered. "Please. Just one word." But it carried such weight, she couldn't refuse. He kissed her, fierce and swift. "Promise me you'll stay safe. Promise me you'll come back. Always." Then he was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Lila froze only a moment before instinct took hold. She raced to the kitchen, pulling the rifle Silas kept behind the door and checking the chamber. The cellar was safer, but underground she'd be blind. Instead, she dragged a table to brace the kitchen door, doused all lamps but one, and left it burning low in the window. Outside she caught movement, men running from the bunkhouse, Caleb and Silas leading them into the night. Wade and his two companions lagged behind, slow to answer the alarm. Suspicion gnawed at her. The waiting was torture. Every creak of the old house, every rattle of shutters set her nerves on edge. Her heartbeat pounded so hard it seemed the intruders might hear it. She thought of Henry, of sitting helpless as fever carried him off. But this was different. Here, at least, she could fight. Then the night exploded. Gunfire cracked sharp and sudden. Not one shot, but many, echoing across the open land. Flashes lit the horizon near the creek bed. Voices shouted, though the words blurred in distance and wind. The prairie carried the sound like distant thunder rolling closer. She gripped the rifle so tight her knuckles whitened, straining to hear beyond the chaos. Then more shots. Closer now. Her chest tightened. The door slammed open. She swung the rifle up. Finger on the trigger. Mrs. Porter. It was Jamie Pike. The boy staggered in, blood streaming down one side of his head. His face was pale as winter. "Caleb sent me. He's hurt, he needs," before he could finish. Wade shouldered into the doorway, knocking Jamie aside. The boy crumpled against the wall with a groan. Wade's clothes were spotless. No dust, no blood, no sign of a man who'd been in a firefight. His smile was cold, cruel. "Well, now," he drawled. What a shame to waste all this excitement. Lila kept the rifle leveled at his chest. "Get out." "Don't think so," Wade said, stepping further into the lamplight. "Mr. Mason's paying well for details. Schedules, weak spots. Didn't expect a bonus like you. Though?" His eyes traveled over her with insolence that made her stomach churn. "I said get out." Her voice was steady, though terror clawed at her insides. "One woman with a rifle she's never fired," he mocked, taking another step closer. "Where's your protector now, right here?" The voice was Caleb's, rough but firm. He filled the doorway, his left arm hanging limp, blood soaking his shirt. But the revolver in his right hand was steady as stone, pointed straight at Wade's head. "You should have stayed bought," Caleb said, his voice like iron. Wade sneered, but for the first time doubt flickered in his eyes. "You should have chosen your side better." Caleb Rowan's voice cut through the smoky kitchen like steel drawn from a scabbard. His revolver never wavered. "Drop your gun." Slow. For one long, dangerous breath, everything hung in balance. Wade's lips curved in that same mocking smile. His hand twitched toward his holster faster than thought, but not faster than Caleb. 2 shots cracked almost as one, the sound echoing off the log walls. Wade cried out, clutching his shoulder, his pistol clattering useless across the floorboards. Caleb staggered but kept his stance, his Colt steady, smoke drifting from the barrel. His green eyes were hard as prairie stone. "Anyone else?" he demanded, his gaze shifting toward the dark beyond the open doorway. A figure stepped cautiously into the light. Collins raised both hands. "Just me. I'm finished with this." Doyle lit out the minute the shooting started. Wade was the only one taking Mason's coin. Caleb's jaw tightened. "Then ride. And don't stop till you hit Colorado. You show your face here again, you won't walk away." Collins didn't need telling twice. He grabbed Wade, half-hauling the cursing man upright, and together they stumbled into the night. The sound of hoofbeats faded into the darkness. Only then did Caleb's strength give out. His knees buckled, the revolver slipping from his grip. Lila Porter darted forward, catching him as he sagged against the frame. Her palm pressed instinctively to his chest and came away red. Blood soaked through his shirt, high on the left side. His face was gray, the strong lines softened by pain. "Don't you dare," she whispered fiercely, lowering him gently to the floor. "You promised me you'd come back." His lips quirked in a weak smile. "I did come back. Others coming. Save your strength," she snapped, pressing a clean cloth to the wound. "Jamie, boil water now." The boy scrambled to obey, his head still wrapped from the gash he'd taken. Boots thundered on the porch. Silas Rowan burst in, taking in the scene with a single glance. His eyes narrowed, but his hands were steady as he knelt. Bullets still in him, Lila's voice was crisp, every bit of her father's old medical lessons rising in her. "High chest, missed the lung, but he's bleeding fast. We need to keep him breathing until Dr. Hale gets here." Men crowded into the kitchen, their faces lined with dust, soot, and blood. Jed Cole leaned heavily on his rifle, while Pete hovered at the door, eyes wide with fear and determination. Someone had already been sent riding hard for the doctor, but it would be hours before help arrived. Through it all, Lila worked, her hands sure. She pressed cloth to the wound, bound strips tight around his chest, checked his pulse, refused to let him drift. "Talk to me," she ordered, leaning close. "Stay awake." "Bossy," Caleb rasped, his words slurred but stubborn. "Always like that. About you." Her eyes burned, but she forced a crooked smile. "Then you'll love being married to me." The words slipped out, unbidden, wild, but true. Caleb's eyes sharpened through the haze of pain. "That a proposal, maybe," she said, choking back tears. "But you'll have to live to find out." He gave a ragged breath that might have been a laugh. "Motivation." Hours blurred together, a battle of cloth and water, whispered words and sheer willpower. At last, dawn crept pale and cold across the prairie. Dr. Everett Hale arrived, breathless from the long ride. One look at Caleb's bandages drew a whistle of admiration. "Whoever did this saved his life," the doctor said. "Setting to work. Bullet missed the lung by inches. Good pressure. Clean dressings. You gave him a fighting chance." "I wasn't about to let him die," Lila replied simply. Outside, The ranch was quiet again. Mason's men had scattered in the night, driven off by Rowan grit and the timely arrival of neighbors. Jed explained later that he'd sent word ahead of the fight. "Out here, one man's trouble belongs to all of us," he said. "Mason won't risk another push soon, not after tonight." But Lila hardly heard him. She stayed at Caleb's side, through the doctor's steady hands, through the fever that followed and finally broke, through the restless dreams where he called her name. When at last his eyes opened clear, she was there, brushing damp hair back from his forehead. His voice was weak but threaded with humor. "Don't you have a kitchen to run?" "The kitchen can wait," she murmured, her hand tender against his cheek. He caught her wrist, his grip fragile but intent. "Did you mean it? About marrying?" Her heart twisted. Which one of us proposed to which? But his gaze was steady now, green eyes filled with something deeper than teasing. "Yes, Lila, if you'll have a half-ruined rancher with a habit of bad luck, I'll give you everything I've got." She bent and kissed him, soft and sure. Yes. Caleb Rowan. Yes to everything. Outside, life continued, cattle bawling in the pens, men calling to one another, the prairie wind sweeping eternal across the grass. Rowan Ranch had survived another trial, and there would be more. But sitting at his side, Lila felt no fear. Together, they were strong enough. Together, they had already won. The land always demanded, always tested. Yet sometimes, if you fought hard enough and loved fiercely enough, the frontier gave back more than it took. 2 weeks later, at dawn, the trial returned. Lila woke to the thunder of hooves and the crack of rifles. Sleep had been shallow, restless. Her revolver lay within reach on the nightstand, a gift from Caleb, and she snatched it up as Billy's voice rang from the yard. Mason's men coming from the north. Her heart hammered, but her hands were steady as she pulled on her dress and boots. Through the small window, she saw them riders pouring over the rise. Not a dozen this time, but twice that number. Mason had hired more guns, determined to finish what he'd started. She slung her rifle and ammunition over one shoulder and raced for the kitchen. Its wide windows gave the best view of the approaches. Caleb was already there, his shirt half buttoned, the bandages beneath still fresh. Pain lined his face, but his eyes burned with resolve. He worked the lever of his Winchester with practiced ease. "I told you to stay in your room," he said without looking at her. "And I told you I'm no hider." She crossed the room and took her post at the opposite window. "How many 20, maybe more?" he answered grimly. "Pa's got men at the barn and bunkhouse." His jaw tightened. "This isn't a raid, Lila. This is war." As if to underscore his words, a bullet shattered the window beside her, glass raining down across the floor. She dropped instinctively, heart pounding, then rose carefully and returned fire. Her shot went wide, but the riders swerved, forced to scatter. Caleb's eyes flicked to her. "Where'd a merchant's wife learn to shoot like that?" "My father insisted," she said, levering another round. "Said a woman ought to know how to defend herself." She sighted again. Never imagined it would come to this. Though, the battle erupted in earnest. Gunfire rattled from every outbuilding, echoing like thunder over the prairie. Mason's men pressed hard from the north, circling, trying to hem in the ranch buildings. Smoke from black powder drifted across the yard, stinging eyes and throats. Lila stood her ground, each shot fired with her father's lessons ringing in her ears, each breath a prayer. She wasn't just protecting walls of wood and stone. She was fighting for a life remade, for the man she loved, for a chance at something stronger than fear. And outside, the roar of war swallowed the morning. The ranch defenders fired back with every ounce of grit they had, using the barns, sheds, and split-rail fences for cover. They knew every dip in the land, every hollow and ridge, but numbers were against them. From her post, Lila Porter saw riders breaking off, slipping wide like wolves circling cattle. "The barn," Caleb Rowan muttered, sighting down his Winchester. His voice was tight with urgency. "They're going for the barn. If they get the horses, we're done. Without mounts, the ranch would be crippled." He started to push forward, but Lila grabbed his good arm, stopping him. "You're wounded. You won't make it." His eyes flared. "And you will. Like hell I won't," she shot back. "I'm faster, and they'll never expect me. Just cover me." Before he could argue, she snatched extra cartridges and slipped out the back, running low across the open ground. Bullets shrieked past like angry bees, but Caleb's covering fire forced most of the attackers to duck. She reached the side door of the barn, flung it open, and darted inside. Samuel, old Jedediah, Cole, and two younger hands crouched behind hay bales, rifles hot in their fists, their faces lit in shock at the sight of her. "Mrs. Porter, what in Jed began? Defending what's ours," she snapped, sliding down beside them. Through the wide barn doors, she could see Mason's men forming a line, preparing to charge. The earth itself seemed to tremble under their horses. "If they rush us, we'll never hold," she said, heart hammering. Jed's weathered face was grim. "No, ma'am, we won't." Then an idea struck her, reckless, maybe deadly, but the only chance. She turned, eyes blazing. "The horses. If we drive them out right as Mason's men charge, a stampede." Understanding lit Jed's eyes. "Might work. Might kill us all, too." One of the younger hands muttered. "Better than certain death," Lila said. They moved quickly, opening stall doors, whispering calm words to panicked animals. The horses snorted and stamped, already rattled by the gunfire outside. Lila's pulse thundered as she peered through a crack in the wall, and then she saw him, Clayton Mason himself, sitting tall in the saddle, sure of victory. Now she shouted. They fired shots into the air, slapped rumps, and threw the doors wide. A wave of terrified horses thundered out, 20 strong, right into the line of charging riders. The collision was bedlam. Screams of men, shrieks of animals, dust boiling up to choke the air. Horses toppled, riders spilled, the charge collapsing in chaos. Lila caught sight of Mason's mount rearing high, pitching him into the dirt. Another rider went down hard. In the swirl of dust and confusion, the ranch hands picked their shots with deadly care. More outlaws scattered. But even as relief surged, Jed's shout cut through. The house smoke curled upward, thin at first, then blacker, thicker. Someone had hurled a torch. They'd used the barn fight as distraction. Lila didn't think, she just ran. Her lungs burned. Her skirts caught on brush. But she burst into the kitchen to find Caleb already there, throwing buckets of water onto the flames, licking up the porch. His bandages were soaked crimson from reopened wounds. But he didn't falter. "You stubborn fool," she gasped, grabbing another bucket. "You stubborn woman," he shot back, gritting his teeth. Side by side they fought, coughing in the smoke, passing water, beating back sparks. Together they smothered the fire before it spread far, though the kitchen was thick with haze. Then the doorway darkened. Clayton Mason himself stood there, clothes dusty, eyes like burning coal. His pistol was leveled steady on them. Should have sold when I offered, he sneered, voice like gravel. His gaze flicked to Lila with ugly promise. Now I'll take it all, including your woman. Caleb straightened, empty-handed, his rifle across the room. The only thing you'll take is a bullet. Mason's mouth twisted into a cruel smile. From who you're unarmed. Boy, he's not alone, came a steady voice. Silas Rowan stepped from behind Mason, an old Sharps rifle pressed firm against his spine. Drop it. Clayton, game's over. For a single heartbeat. The air froze. Then Mason snarled, twisting to bring his gun around. 3 shots cracked as one. Mason jerked sideways, his pistol spinning from his hand. Lila's Colt smoked in her trembling grip. She'd hit his shoulder. Silas's bullet tore into his leg. Caleb's knife had sunk deep into Mason's gun hand. The land grabber collapsed, writhing on the floor, cursing through gritted teeth. Nice shooting, Caleb said hoarsely, lowering his arm. All of us. Outside. The fight was already dying. Without Mason to lead them, the hired guns broke apart, fleeing into the prairie. Neighbors, drawn by the smoke and gunfire, had arrived on horseback to finish the rout. The siege was broken. It's done, Silas said quietly, looking down at the fallen man. Fetch the sheriff. The aftermath blurred men rushing, the sheriff arriving with deputies to haul Mason and the stragglers into custody. Dr. Hale tending wounds. Caleb's stitches torn loose again. Burns seared across Lila's palms. Cuts and bruises marked nearly every hand on the ranch. Yet they were alive. By sunset, the ranch yard was full of neighbors sharing food and strong coffee, pledging mutual aid, shaking hands. Rowan Ranch had bent, but it had not broken. As the sky flamed with evening light, Lila stood on the porch, surveying the damage. Bullet holes scarred the siding. Glass lay shattered underfoot. One corner of the porch was black with char, but the ranch still stood. We'll need to rebuild, Caleb said, joining her, his arm in a sling, face pale but steady. We will, she answered. Then the full weight of the day hit her. The fire, the fight, the narrow edge between life and death. Her knees gave way. Caleb caught her, holding her tight with his good arm. Hey, he murmured, pressing his cheek to her hair. It's over. We're safe. I shot a man, she whispered, voice breaking. I've never. You saved us, he said fiercely. All of us. Don't you ever forget that. Tears slid down her soot-stained face. Is this what life will always be? Fighting for what's ours? Sometimes, he admitted. Then his voice gentled. But most days won't look like this. Most days will be quiet. Cooking breakfast, riding the fence line, watching sunsets, raising children who'll be just as stubborn as you. Children, despite everything. Warmth bloomed inside her chest. She lifted her gaze to his, the green eyes steady on hers. If you want, he said softly. When you're ready. I know today was proof, she cut in. Proof of what? That I belong here, that this place is home, that what we're building is worth every fight. She cupped his cheek with a scarred, soot-marked hand. I love you. Caleb Rowan. The ranch yard still bore scars from the fight-patched timbers, scorched porch boards, and bullet marks filled with fresh plaster. But that evening it felt as though the land itself had chosen to celebrate. Lanterns swung from posts, ribbons stretched overhead in the spring wind, and laughter rippled across the gathered crowd. Caleb Rowan drew Lila Porter close, his lips brushing hers with a kiss deep and sure, a vow in itself. I love this ranch, he said quietly, voice rough with emotion. I love the people here, I even love this stubborn land that tries its best to kill us. But most of all, I love you. Marry me. Lila. Soon. I don't want to wait." She rested her forehead against his, heart racing. "Next week," she whispered. "As soon as you can stand through the vows without toppling over." A sharp whoop echoed from behind them. Jamie Pike, unable to contain himself, had overheard. Within minutes, word had spread from bunkhouse to barn. She could mend a fence at noon and bake biscuits by sunrise, cradle the wounded with tenderness, and still pick up a rifle when the ranch called for it. And in the midst of hardship, she had found love. Not despite the fire, but forged within it. Caleb found her in the hallway, his arm still in its sling, his smile weary but warm. "We'll gathering again," he teased. She smiled faintly. "Thinking about gold." He frowned. "Gold. You were right from the start," she said softly. "Gold wasn't what this land needed. I see that now." Her thoughts turned to the wedding ring tucked away in a drawer, relic of another life. It needed someone too stubborn to quit. Caleb's gaze softened. He touched her cheek with his good hand. "No, it needed you. We all did. Still do. Tomorrow would bring new trials fences to mend, cattle to track, barns to repair, and now a wedding to plan in the middle of it all. Mason might be gone, hauled off to face justice, but the frontier never ran out of men eager to take what others had built. Vigilance would always be demanded. But that night, in a house scarred yet still standing, surrounded by people who had become kin, Lila felt only gratitude. She had given up a ring in despair and had gained something greater, a home, a purpose, and a love worth every fight. But that night, in a house scarred yet still standing, surrounded by people who had become kin, Lila felt only gratitude. She had given up a ring in despair and had gained something greater, a home, a purpose, and a love worth every fight. "A little nervous. I feel like I might faint," Lila admitted, pressing a hand to her stomach. "Every bride feels that way. Mrs., Kincaid said with a laugh. "Even me, 40 years ago. And trust me, your young man is worse. Last I saw him, he was pacing the parlor like a wolf in a cage. Through the window, Lila could see the yard transformed. Long tables borrowed from neighbors sagged with platters of food. Women from across the county had filled her kitchen for days, baking pies and biscuits, stirring kettles of stew. Wildflowers brightened every surface, and colorful ribbons stretched from post to post, turning the workyard into a place of celebration. Half the county had gathered men, women, children, all eager to see light return after months of darkness. A knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. Silas Rowan entered, awkward in his best black suit. His hands held a small wooden box. He cleared his throat. This belonged to Margaret. Her mother brought it from Ireland long ago. She'd want you to wear it. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was a delicate comb adorned with tiny pearls. Lila's throat tightened as Silas gently placed it in her hair. "Thank you," she whispered. "No, Lila, thank you." His voice was rough but sincere. "You brought my boy back to life. You breathed life into this whole ranch. Margaret would have loved you." He offered his arm. "Come, let's not keep Caleb waiting. He's liable to wear a hole through the floor." The walk from the house to the yard felt both endless and too quick. Oh, the crowd quieted as she appeared, the makeshift aisle opening wide. At the far end, Caleb stood tall, face alight with wonder, despite the sling holding his arm. When his eyes met hers, the nervous flutter inside her chest quieted. For a moment, there was no one else. Nothing else. Just the two of them. Jamie Pike stood beside Caleb as best man, trying for solemnity, but failing. His grin too broad. Jedediah Cole stood with the other hands, all scrubbed and dressed in their Sunday clothes, pride written across their weathered faces. Even Rosie, the milk cow, had been adorned with ribbons and grazed nearby, unconcerned, but strangely fitting in the scene. The minister, fetched from town, cleared his throat and began, keeping the words simple as requested. If anyone here has reason, these two should not be joined. Speak now. The air was still. Not a whisper stirred the gathered crowd. Lila's eyes remained locked on Caleb's, and when the vows were spoken, she meant every word. In her heart she knew she hadn't merely survived. She had found her place. A meadowlark trilled from the fence post, its cheerful call so perfectly timed that laughter rolled across the crowd. Caleb Rowan's hands were steady and warm as he slid a plain gold band onto Lila Porter's finger. It was not ornate like the ring she had once worn, but it was solid, enduring, and true, just like the man giving it. I now pronounce you husband and wife. The minister declared, you may kiss your bride. Caleb did not need the permission twice. He pulled Lila close and kissed her soundly, the kind of kiss that left her breathless and left the cowboys hollering with delight while the church ladies clucked in mock disapproval. When they parted, both laughing, the celebration erupted all around them in a roar of joy. The rest of the day became a tapestry of happiness stitched together by music, dancing, and voices lifted in cheer. The fiddle players struck lively tunes, and Caleb proved he had indeed been practicing, whirling Lila across the makeshift dance floor. Toasts followed, some eloquent, some painfully honest, especially once Buck Tanner's corn liquor made its inevitable appearance. Oku, there was food enough to feed an army. Lila's pies and biscuits joined by dishes brought by every ranch wife for miles. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky with strokes of rose and gold, Caleb slipped his hand into Lila's and drew her away from the revelry. They climbed the hill behind the house where prairie roses grew wild around 3 wooden crosses. He paused at the top, his voice hushed. I wanted to bring you here, to meet them proper. Lila understood at once. She knelt beside Margaret Rowan's grave, laying her bouquet of wildflowers at its base. I'll care for them, she whispered. Your son, your husband, this land you loved. I'll tend it all as you would have wanted. The prairie wind stirred, brushing her cheek as if in answer. For a moment she felt Margaret's approval in that touch. Caleb helped her rise, holding her close as the horizon burned with color. No regrets, he asked quietly. She thought back to the desperate woman who had once stood in Holbrook's store, ring in hand, begging for bread. That woman was gone. In her place stood a wife, a partner, a woman who had fought for a home and won it. None, she said with certainty. Then, with a small smile, though sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you hadn't walked into that store. Caleb's arms tightened around her. I'd have found you somehow. Some things are meant to be. Lila Rowan. The name felt right on his lips, and even more right in her heart. Not a replacement for who she had once been, but a fuller version of herself. The merchant's widow had become a rancher's wife, but more than that, she had become her own woman. We'd best get back, she said at last, before Jamie drinks all of Buck's moonshine and starts singing the songs he thinks I don't know he knows. Caleb laughed. Too late. I heard him start on Sweet Betsy from Pike a good 10 minutes ago." Hand in hand they walked back, the celebration still in full swing. When the crowd spotted them, a call rose up for a speech. Caleb lifted an eyebrow at Lila, who gave him a nod. "Friends," he began, his voice carrying clear and strong across the yard. "A year ago this ranch was dying. We'd lost my mother, lost our way, lost hope. Then a woman came into our lives and reminded us that gold isn't what matters out here." His eyes found Lila's, love plain as day. What matters is grit, courage, the willingness to build something worth defending, the grace to find beauty even in hardship, and the strength to choose hope when despair would be easier. Lila stepped forward, her own voice ringing steady. "What matters," she said, "is finding people who will stand beside you when the storms come. Folks who'll show you that home isn't about where you started, but where you choose to plant your feet and grow." The cheer that followed shook the night, echoing across the prairie. As music struck up again and the lanterns glowed brighter, Lila was swept into dance after dance, conversation after conversation. Yet no matter how many hands she clasped or how many compliments she heard, her eyes always found Caleb's across the crowd, a steady beacon in the happy whirlwind. Later, much later, when the last guests had drifted home or settled into the barn, when the laughter faded to soft snores and the fiddles lay quiet, Caleb and Lila stood alone in their kitchen in their home. "Happy?" he asked, drawing her close. "More than I thought possible," she replied, resting her head against his shoulder. "Though I should warn you, I still can't milk Rosie without her glaring at me." He chuckled, brushing his lips against her hair. "We'll work on it. We've got time. Time. Such a precious gift." She had thought she'd lost it forever when Henry Talbot died. But tonight she understood time wasn't only about length of days. It was about filling them deeply, with purpose, with love, with courage enough to keep building, even when the world tried to tear it all down. Through the window, stars wheeled across the vast prairie sky. Tomorrow would bring work. There was always work. But tonight, in her husband's arms, Lila knew peace. She thought of that first desperate meeting, of Caleb's kind green eyes, and the words that had changed everything. "Gold isn't what we need. You are." He had seen her clearly when she could hardly see herself, and because of that, she had discovered the strength to rise again. The simple gold band on her finger caught the lamplight. Upstairs, tucked safely in a drawer, rested Henry's ring, not discarded, not forgotten, just laid to rest, a memory that no longer bound her. Caleb had been right. The past was not a weight, but a foundation, and she carried it differently now. "What are you thinking?" Caleb asked, sensing her quiet reflection. "About gold," she said with a smile. "About bargains. About losses that turn into gifts, and how sometimes losing everything is the only way to find what you really need." He kissed her, gentle and sure. When at last they climbed the stairs together, Lila paused at the landing. She looked back at the kitchen, her kingdom, her refuge, the heart of the home where she had rediscovered herself. Tomorrow she would rise before dawn, brew coffee strong enough to wake the hands, bake biscuits light enough to earn Jamie's devotion. She would tend her garden, wrestle with Rosie, and little by little help. Caleb strengthened the ranch into something greater than either of them had imagined. But tonight, she was simply Lila Rowan, prairie wife, stepping into a future that felt wide as the horizon. The frontier had tested her and found her worthy. Now it was her time to live fully, to love deeply, and to build the life she had fought so fiercely to claim. And what a life it would be! At its heart, this story isn't only about the hardships of a widow or the battles of a ranch. It's a reminder that true worth isn't found in possessions, but in resilience, courage, and the love we dare to accept after loss. Many of us over 60 know the sting of grief and the weight of letting go. Like Lila, we may carry reminders of the past that anchor us more than they free us. Her journey shows us that healing doesn't erase what came before it transforms it. Gold can tarnish, homes can burn, and fortunes can vanish, but strength of spirit remains. And when shared with others, it multiplies. Caleb didn't need her ring. He needed her presence, her courage, her stubborn hope. That's what turned a broken ranch into a home again. For us, the lesson is simple but profound. The past shapes us, but it doesn't have to bind us. Even late in life, we can choose to build again, love again, and believe again. And sometimes, what we thought was the end may truly be the beginning of something greater. Thank you, dear friends, for walking this journey with us. If Lila and Caleb's story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps keep these timeless tales of love and resilience alive for generations to come.